Welcome to Dr. Harmony. We dive deep into the silent fractures of the modern family, exploring the secrets we keep and the prices we pay for love. Today's story is a harrowing journey of a father who provided everything only to be seen as nothing. It is a cautionary tale about the invisibility of sacrifice and the toxic sting of entitlement. If you have ever felt undervalued or misunderstood by those you love most, this story is for you. Sit back, reflect, and let's begin this journey into the heart of a home built on a foundation of hidden truths and painful deceptions. I am a failure, not because I lack the means to provide, but because I failed to teach my children the value of the man standing right in front of them. My name is Arthur Vance, and for 30 years I have lived a double life within the very walls of my own home in the heart of Chicago. To the outside world, specifically the board of directors at Sterling Global, I am the silent architect of a multi-million-dollar empire, a remote CEO who manages assets with a surgical precision that few can match. But to my son, Ethan, and my daughter, Eleanor, I am nothing more than a ghost in a worn-out bathrobe, a senile, penniless burden who occupies the master bedroom and contributes nothing to the family's survival. I let them believe this. I watched as they grew from innocent children into cold, calculating adults who view me with a mixture of pity and utter disgust. Every morning I sit in my home office, which they think is just a room where I hide to nap, and I authorize the wire transfers that keep their lavish lifestyles afloat. I pay for Ethan's high-rise loft, his luxury sports cars, and his failed business ventures. I pay for Eleanor's designer wardrobe, her socialite galas, and the mortgage on the house she barely visits. They think the money comes from a trust fund set up by their late mother, a woman they barely remember, but have sainted in my stead. In reality, their mother left us with nothing but debt. It was my sweat, my sleepless nights, and my anonymity that built the fortress they now occupy. But as I sit here today, listening to them argue in the hallway about which nursing home is the cheapest option for the old man, I realize that my silence was my greatest mistake. I wanted to protect them from the stress of wealth, to see if they could find their own way. Instead, I raised two vultures who are circling my living body, waiting for the final breath so they can scavenge what they believe is left of a dwindling inheritance. They call me a parasite. They tell their friends that their father is a tragic case of early-onset stagnation, a man who simply gave up on life and chose to live off the scraps of his children's hard-earned success. Little do they know, the very floor they stand on is owned by me, the coffee they drink is paid for by me, and the air they breathe in this house is a courtesy of my continued patience. But that patience has reached its absolute limit. The humiliation began subtly years ago, but it has now reached a fever pitch of open hostility. Last night I sat at the dinner table, a bill I bought, and listened as Ethan explained to his latest girlfriend that I was retired in the mental sense. He didn't even lower his voice. He spoke as if I were a piece of furniture, a relic of a bygone era that no longer functioned. Eleanor chimed in, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that felt like vinegar on an open wound. She told the girl that it was such a shame I hadn't managed to save a dime during my supposed career, and that they were saints for keeping me under their roof. I looked down at my plate, my hands trembling not with age, but with a suppressed rage that threatened to boil over. I could have ended it then. I could have pulled out my phone, logged into the primary business account, and shown them the 8-figure balance that grows with every passing hour. I could have shown them the deeds to the properties they call their own, all held under my private holding company. But I didn't. I wanted to see how far they would go. I wanted to know if there was a single shred of genuine affection left in their hollowed-out hearts, or if they were entirely consumed by the greed they didn't even realize I was feeding. Ethan leaned over and patted my hand, a gesture so patronizing it made my skin crawl. "Don't worry, Dad," he said, smirking at his girlfriend. "We'll find a place for you where the walls are padded and the pudding is soft. You won't have to worry about being a burden much longer." The girlfriend giggled, a hollow, vapid sound that echoed in the vaulted ceiling of the dining room. I looked Ethan in the eye, the same eyes I used to read bedtime stories to, and I saw nothing but a stranger. I saw a man who had been blinded by a silver spoon he didn't even know I was holding. Eleanor started talking about the estate sale, discussing which of my old junk they would toss and which pieces of art, which she assumes are fakes, they might be able to get a few dollars for at a flea market. They are planning my erasure while I am still sitting in the chair. They have no idea that the junk in my office includes original manuscripts and signed lithographs worth more than both their careers combined. They see a man who doesn't go to an office, so they assume he has no job. They see a man who stays home, so they assume he has no life. In their world, if it isn't performed for an audience, it isn't real. The air in the house grew colder with every passing day, or perhaps it was just the atmosphere my children created. I spent most of my time locked in the sanctuary of my office, the one place where I was still king. Through the high-speed fiber optic lines I'd had installed under the guise of better cable TV, I moved mountains. I orchestrated a merger between two tech giants in Seattle while Ethan was downstairs complaining that the internet was lagging because the old man is probably watching static again. I sat behind my mahogany desk, the glow of 3 monitors illuminating the deep lines on my face, watching the digital ticker of my success. But the moment I stepped outside that door, I had to transform back into the shell they expected. I practiced a slight shuffle in my walk. I let my hair grow a bit unkempt. I wore the same gray cardigan with the loose thread on the sleeve. It was a masquerade of misery, a social experiment that had gone on far too long. I was waiting for a sign, any sign, that they cared for the man, and not just the convenience of having a scapegoat for their frustrations. But the signs I received were far more sinister. One afternoon, while I was supposedly napping, I heard Eleanor's sharp heels clicking on the hardwood floor outside my door. She wasn't alone. I heard the muffled voice of a man, a lawyer I didn't recognize. They were whispering about power of attorney. "He's clearly not lucid anymore," Eleanor whispered, her voice devoid of any warmth. "He sits in there for 10 hours a day staring at a blank wall. If we get him declared incompetent, we can sell this house and finally move into the penthouse at the Ascent. Ethan is already talking to a broker." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were actively trying to strip away my legal existence. They wanted to turn me into a ward of the state, a ghost with no rights, all so they could liquidate the assets they thought were their birthright. I felt a cold realization wash over me. The children I had raised to be strong and independent had instead become scavengers. I had shielded them too much. By giving them everything without showing them the source, I had robbed them of their humanity. I had allowed them to believe that the world owed them comfort, and that I was merely an obstacle in the way of more of it. That evening, the betrayal took a physical form. Ethan came into my office without knocking, a boundary he had recently decided no longer applied. He didn't see the monitors. I had switched them to a screensaver of a digital fireplace the moment I heard his heavy footsteps. He looked around the room with a sneer, his eyes landing on an antique globe in the corner. It was a 17th century original, worth more than his entire car collection. "Dad," he started, his voice loud as if he were speaking to someone stone deaf. "We're having a little dinner party tonight. Important people. Why don't you stay in here? We'll bring you a tray. You don't want to embarrass yourself in front of my investors." I looked up at him, letting my eyes glaze over, just enough to play the part. "Investors, Ethan? What are you pitching this time?" He scoffed, turning his back to me to examine a bookshelf. "Something you wouldn't understand. A crypto equity fund. Real money, Dad. Not the kind of pennies you used to scrape together at that paper company you claim you worked for." I almost laughed. The paper company was actually a global logistics firm that I still own 60% of. "I see," I said softly. "And what if I want to come out and meet these people? I might have some advice." Ethan turned around, his face reddening. Advice? From a man who hasn't held a paycheck in 20 years? Look at you. You're a ghost, Arthur. You're a relic. Just stay in your hole and let the adults handle the future. He slammed the door, and for a moment the silence was deafening. I looked at the digital fireplace on my screen. I could turn it off. I could cut off their access to the bank accounts tonight. I could watch their credit cards decline at their fancy dinner. I could watch the investors walk out when the wine stops flowing and the lights go out. But no, that would be too quick. If I was a failure as a father, I would at least be a master of the lesson. I needed them to fall, but I needed them to see the height from which they were falling. I needed them to understand that the parasite they loathed was the only thing keeping them from the street. I began to type. I sent an encrypted message to my head of security and my chief financial officer. Phase 1, I wrote. Begin the asset migration. Make it look like a market crash. I want them to feel the first chill of winter. As the night progressed, the sounds of laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses drifted up from the dining room. I sat in the dark, a silent observer in my own kingdom. I heard Eleanor bragging about her inheritance, talking about the renovations she planned to make to the house once I was relocated. She spoke of knocking down my office walls to create an open-concept yoga studio. They were already tearing my life apart in their minds. They had no idea that at that very moment, the automated systems I had built were beginning to revoke their privileges. The first blow would be small, a declined transaction for the catering bill. I waited, my pulse steady as I heard the first signs of confusion from the kitchen. The drama was only beginning, and for the first time in a decade, I felt truly alive. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was the judge, and the court was now in session. The confusion downstairs began as a low murmur, a ripple in the otherwise smooth surface of their arrogance. I leaned back in my chair, the darkness of my office acting as a shroud. I didn't need light to see. I knew every corner of this house, every creak in the floorboards, and every flaw in my children's character. Through the baby monitor, I had accidentally left active in the kitchen months ago, a device they thought was a broken relic. I heard the caterer's voice. It was tight, professional but firm. I'm sorry, Ms. Vance, but the card has been declined. Both of them, actually. Eleanor's response was a sharp, jagged laugh. That's impossible. Try it again. It's a black card. It doesn't have a limit. There was a pause, the sound of a machine resetting, and then the inevitable. Still declined, ma'am. Perhaps there's a hold on the account. I could almost see her face turning that specific shade of frantic crimson. In her world, a declined card wasn't just a financial hiccup. It was a social death sentence. I heard Ethan's heavy footsteps enter the kitchen. What's the hold-up? The appetizers are late, and the guests are getting restless. When Eleanor hissed the news to him, Ethan's voice dropped an octave, dripping with a desperate bravado. It's probably just the bank's security. I'll call the private banker. Just tell the caterer we'll wire it tomorrow. He knows who we are. But the caterer didn't care who they were. He cared about the $5,000 worth of lobster tail and vintage champagne currently being consumed in the other room. This was the first crack in the porcelain tower I had built for them. I sat there, watching the digital clock on my desk glow a cold neon blue. They had spent years mocking my inactivity, never realizing that my inactivity was the only thing keeping their world spinning. Ethan's phone calls began. I could hear him pacing the hallway outside my door, his voice a frantic whisper as he tried to reach our family representative at the bank. What he didn't know was that I had redirected all calls from his number to a dead-end VoIP line I controlled. To him, it sounded like a busy signal, a technical glitch in the matrix of his privilege. He pounded on the wall in frustration, a sound that would have once made me jump to help him. Now, it was just rhythm. I felt a strange, detached coldness. Was I being cruel? Perhaps. But as I listened to them discuss me again, Ethan suggesting they take my emergency credit card from my wallet while I slept, I knew that any lingering guilt was a luxury I could no longer afford. They weren't just entitled, they were predatory. They viewed me as a resource to be mined, not a father to be loved. "Just go into his room," Eleanor whispered. I heard them hovering outside my door. "He's probably passed out. He's always asleep by 9. Just find the wallet, Ethan. We need to pay these people before they make a scene in front of the investors." The door handle turned slowly. I didn't move. I didn't hide the monitors this time. I sat perfectly still, my silhouette framed by the glowing data streams of a billion-dollar company. The door creaked open, and the hallway light spilled across the floor like a pale accusation. Ethan stepped in first, followed by Eleanor. They stopped dead. They expected to find a snoring old man in a chair. Instead, they found the commander of a digital war room. The blue light reflected off my glasses, making my eyes look like cold embers. "Searching for something?" I asked. My voice was calm, devoid of the shaky uncertainty I usually used to placate them. Ethan froze, his hand halfway to my desk. Eleanor gasped, clutching her designer pearls. For a moment, the mask slipped. They saw the clarity in my gaze, the sharp, piercing intelligence they had spent years convincing themselves I had lost. "Dad," Ethan stammered, his bravado crumbling. We thought you were asleep. The power went out on our cards. We thought maybe you had an emergency backup." I stood up, slowly, making sure they felt the full weight of my presence. I am not a tall man, but in that moment I towered over them. "The cards didn't fail, Ethan. I deactivated them, and I didn't have a backup. I am the source." Eleanor let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. "The source? Dad, what are you talking about? You haven't worked in decades. You live on Mom's trust." I walked toward them, and they actually backed away, retreating toward the door. "Your mother's trust was exhausted 3 years after she passed away," I said, each word a cold stone dropped into a deep well. "Every cent you have spent, every car, every dress, every failed investment came from the work I do in this room. While you were out networking and building brands, I was managing the capital that allowed you to pretend you were successful. But the simulation is over. I am tired of being the ghost in your machine." Ethan's face twisted from shock to a familiar, ugly sneer. "You're lying. You're just a senile old man having a delusion. You probably just forgot to pay the bills, and now you're trying to act like a mastermind. Give me the wallet, Arthur. Now." He stepped forward, his fists clenched, the ultimate betrayal finally taking a physical form. He was ready to rob his own father to maintain a lie. Ethan took another step, his shadow stretching across the floor like a predator's. I didn't flinch. I simply tapped a key on my laptop. Suddenly, the wall-mounted television in my office flickered to life, displaying a real-time ledger of the Vance family trust. The balance dropped to 0 in front of their eyes. Then I pulled up a secondary screen, a live feed of Ethan's personal brokerage account. With one more click, I initiated a margin call that I had secretly engineered weeks ago. His face went ghostly white as he watched his digital net worth evaporate into a sea of red. "What did you do?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "That's my money! That's my future!" I looked at him with a pity that cut deeper than any insult. "No, Ethan. That was my patience. And it just ran out." Eleanor was shaking, her eyes darting between the screens and the man she thought she knew. "You've been lying to us," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and realization. "You let us believe you were nothing. Why? Why would you do this to your own children?" I walked over to the window, looking out at the glittering lights of the Chicago skyline, half of which were powered by companies I held major stakes in. "I didn't do this to you, Eleanor. I did this for you. I wanted to see if, given the freedom of wealth, you would become people of substance. Instead, you became people of shadow. You use the resources I provided to buy friends who don't like you and status that doesn't exist. You treated your own father like a tenant in his own home because you thought I had no value left to extract. The room felt small now, the air thick with the smell of expensive perfume and the stench of desperation. Downstairs, the investors were beginning to raise their voices. We could hear the front door slam as someone realized the party was over and the prestige was a facade. Ethan looked at the door, then back at me, his eyes wild. You have to fix this. Now. If those people leave thinking I'm a fraud, my reputation is destroyed. I'll be a laughingstock in the city. He moved toward my desk again, this time reaching for the laptop, thinking he could simply undo the digital tide. I didn't even have to move. My head of security, a man they had always assumed was just a building maintenance guy, stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. He didn't say a word, but his presence was enough to make Ethan freeze in his tracks. The reputation you're so worried about, Ethan, was built on sand, I said, turning back to face them. You are a fraud. You've never closed a deal that wasn't subsidized by a silent partner you never bothered to identify. And Eleanor, your charity foundation is currently being audited because you spent 60% of the donations on travel and administrative expenses. Did you think I wasn't watching? I am the auditor. I am the silent partner. I am the one who kept the wolves from your door, even as you were trying to kick me out of it. Eleanor collapsed into the leather armchair, the one she had promised to throw away during her estate sale planning. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. So, what now? She asked, her voice hollow. Are you going to throw us out? In the middle of the night? Is that your grand plan, Arthur? To be the big bad CEO who fires his own family? I sat back down at my desk, the glow of the screens now the only light in the room. I looked at the two adults I had raised, seeing the scared children they still were underneath the layers of arrogance. No, I said quietly. I'm not throwing you out. That would be too easy for you. You'd just find another host to bleed dry. No, from this moment on, you are going to live the life you told everyone I lived. You are going to stay in this house, but the accounts are frozen. The cars are being repossessed tomorrow morning. The staff has been let go with a very generous severance. Paid by me, of course. Ethan let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. You're joking. You expect us to live here with you. With no money. How are we supposed to eat? How are we supposed to live? I leaned forward, my face inches from his. The same way you thought I did, Ethan. By being parasites. Except there's one difference. I was the host. You are just guests who have overstayed their welcome. There is a pantry full of food and a roof over your heads. Beyond that, you are on your own. If you want luxury, earn it. If you want respect, show it. But don't you ever refer to me as a burden again. They stood there, paralyzed by the sudden shift in the gravity of their lives. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted. It had been demolished and rebuilt in my image. I reached over and picked up a file from my desk, the one Eleanor had seen with the lawyer. I tossed it onto the floor at her feet. And Eleanor? About that power of attorney? I took the liberty of having my own lawyers look into it. If you ever try to file that paperwork, I will have you prosecuted for fraud so fast, your head will spin. Now get out of my office. I have a company to run, and you have a mess downstairs to clean up. As they shuffled out, broken and silent, I didn't feel the triumph I expected. I only felt a profound, heavy sadness. I had won the war, but I had lost my family a long time ago. The following morning, the silence in the house was heavy, a suffocating blanket that replaced the usual sounds of entitlement. I woke up at my usual time, 5 a.m., but I didn't put on the old bathrobe. Instead, I wore a tailored Italian suit that had been hidden in a locked garment bag for years. I walked down the grand staircase, my footsteps echoing with a confidence that had been absent from these halls for a decade. In the kitchen, I found Ethan sitting at the marble island, staring at a bowl of dry cereal. He looked disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed from a night of realization. He didn't look up when I entered. He was staring at his phone, likely watching the notification pings of his social circle turning their backs on him. The news of his financial restructuring had traveled fast. "The coffee is in the pantry, Ethan. You'll have to grind the beans yourself," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't see a victim. He saw a predator who had finally stopped playing dead. "How long, Dad?" he asked, his voice cracking. "How long have you been playing this game?" I poured myself a glass of water, the simplicity of the action feeling like a victory. "It wasn't a game to me, it was an observation. I wanted to see who you were when you thought I had nothing left to give. I gave you 30 years of my life, and you gave me 3 years of mockery." I walked past him toward the front door. "Where are you going?" he asked, a hint of panic rising in his tone. "I have a meeting at Sterling Global, the real one, not the one in your head." As I stepped onto the driveway, a sleek black sedan was waiting. My driver, Marcus, who had been posing as a local handyman for 3 years, held the door open. I saw Eleanor watching from her bedroom window, her face pale behind the glass. She looked like a ghost in her own museum. She was realizing that the man she had planned to ship off to a cheap nursing home was in fact the owner of the very ground she stood on. The drive to the city center was quiet, allowing me to reflect on the wreckage I had left behind. I had spent so long building a fortune to protect them that I had forgotten to build a foundation for their souls. I was the architect of their failure, and now I had to be the architect of their redemption, even if it meant breaking them completely. At the office, the transition was seamless. My staff greeted me with the respect I had earned over decades of secret maneuvers. I sat in my high-back chair, looking out over the skyline, and, for a moment, I felt the weight of my success. But the image of my children's faces haunted me. I wasn't doing this to be cruel. I was doing this because the lies had become a poison. If I died tomorrow, they would have burned through my legacy in a year and ended up in the gutter. By taking it away now, I was giving them a chance to find their own strength. I spent the day dismantling the various shell companies I had used to funnel their allowances. By the time the sun began to set, the Vance children were officially, for the first time in their lives, broke. When I returned home that evening, the house was dark. The power hadn't been cut. I wasn't that heartless. But the mood lighting and heated floors had been deactivated via the smart home system I controlled. I found Eleanor in the living room, surrounded by her designer bags, crying softly. "They're coming for the car, Dad," she sobbed. "The men are outside with a tow truck. Please, don't let them take it. It's all I have left." I sat down opposite her, not in the sagging armchair I usually occupied, but on the edge of the pristine white sofa she usually forbade me from touching. "It's just metal and leather, Eleanor. It's not who you are. Or at least I hope it isn't." She looked at me with a desperate, wild look in her eyes. "Who am I supposed to be then? You've taken everything. You've embarrassed us. How am I supposed to show my face at the gala next week?" I leaned in, my expression stern. "There is no gala, Eleanor. There is only tomorrow. And tomorrow, you are going to find a job. Not a consultancy where you show up for lunch, but a job. I've already sent your resume to a few retail outlets in the city. They're looking for seasonal help." She looked at me as if I had suggested she scrub the streets with a toothbrush. The idea of manual labor, of serving others, was an alien concept to her. But the look in my eyes told her that the time for negotiation had passed. Ethan walked in then, his face bruised. I didn't ask what happened, but I could guess. When the money stops, the friends you've been subsidizing tend to turn violent, or at the very least, very honest. He slumped against the doorframe, looking at the two of us. "The bank called," he muttered. "The loft is being foreclosed. They said the anonymous grantor withdrew the subsidy." He looked at me, a flicker of genuine respect, or perhaps just pure fear in his eyes. "You really did it. You really cut us off." I stood up, smoothing my suit. "I didn't cut you off. I simply stopped the bleeding. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to have dinner. There's plenty of soup in the cabinet. I suggest you learn how to use the stove." The following weeks were a study in the slow, agonizing death of ego. I watched from my office monitors, the ones they still didn't realize were connected to every camera in the house, as Ethan and Eleanor navigated the mundane reality of survival. It was like watching two toddlers learn to walk in a field of glass. Ethan, once the king of the crypto equity world, was now spending his nights staring at a stack of entry-level job descriptions. Eleanor had traded her silk gowns for a standard-issue uniform at a local boutique, returning home with swollen feet and a humbled silence that was louder than any of her previous screams. They were beginning to break, but not in the way I feared. They weren't breaking down. They were breaking open. One night, I sat in the shadows of the kitchen, sipping a glass of water, when I heard them talking in the dining room. There were no guests, no investors, and no pretense. Just the two of them, sharing a single box of store-brand pasta I had intentionally left in the pantry. "I saw Marcus today," Ethan said, his voice low. "The guy we thought was the handyman. He was driving Dad in a Bentley. He looked at me like I was a stranger. Not with hate, just nothing." Eleanor sighed, the sound of a woman who had finally run out of tears. "He's not the person we thought he was, Ethan. We spent years calling him a burden, but we were the ones hanging around his neck. I looked at the bills today, the real ones. Do you have any idea what it costs just to keep the lights on in this place? He's been paying for everything while we insulted him to his face." Ethan was quiet for a long time. "I was going to put him in that home, Eleanor. I already had the brochures in my car. I thought he was taking up space. I thought he was the reason I wasn't reaching my full potential. But now that the money is gone, I realize I don't even have a potential. I'm just a guy who knows how to order expensive wine on someone else's tab." I felt a lump form in my throat. This was the first time I had heard a grain of honesty from either of them in over a decade. But I couldn't stop yet. The lesson wasn't about them feeling bad. It was about them becoming capable. I needed to know that if I were to actually disappear tomorrow, they wouldn't just starve in a house full of gold. I stepped into the room, and for the first time, they didn't look at me with disgust or fear. They looked at me with a profound, unsettled curiosity. "The pasta smells a bit overcooked," I said, taking a seat at the head of the table. Ethan didn't snap back with a sarcastic comment. Instead, he pushed the bowl toward me. "It's all we've got, Dad. You're welcome to half." I looked at the bowl, then at my son. It was the most valuable thing he had ever offered me. "Thank you, Ethan," I whispered. We ate in a silence that was finally, for the first time in years, peaceful. But the world outside didn't care about our family reconciliation. The enemies I had made in the corporate world, the ones who had been waiting for a crack in the Vance empire, saw my children's public fall from grace as an opportunity. A rival firm headed by a man named Victor Thorne had started sniffing around our private holdings. Thorne was a shark who specialized in hostile takeovers of ailing family legacies. He assumed that because my children were in shambles, the company was vulnerable. He didn't realize that the old man was still the one holding the spear. The next morning, a legal courier arrived at the door. It wasn't for me. It was for Ethan. Victor Thorne was offering him a consultancy position with a massive signing bonus. It was a bait, a way to get an inside track into my encrypted files through my son's desperation. I watched through the doorway as Ethan held the check in his trembling hands. It was more money than he had seen in months. It was his way back to the life he missed. The cars, the clubs, the prestige. All he had to do was betray the father he had only just started to respect. Eleanor looked at the check, then at Ethan. "That's the man who tried to sue us 3 years ago," she whispered. "Ethan, don't. It's a trap." Ethan looked at the check, then up at the ceiling, as if he could see me watching. He knew I was there. He knew this was the ultimate test. He looked at the courier, a man in a sharp suit who reminded him of the person he used to be. "Tell Mr. Thorne," Ethan said, his voice gaining a strength I hadn't heard since he was a boy, "that I'm currently employed. I'm working for a man who actually knows the value of $1. And tell him to stay off our property." He ripped the check in half and handed it back. My heart soared. The failure I had felt for 30 years began to lift. I walked out into the hallway and looked at my son. "That was a very expensive piece of paper you just destroyed," I said, a small smile playing on my lips. Ethan looked at me, his eyes clear and focused. "It was trash, Dad. I'm tired of living on trash." I nodded, the gravity of the moment settling between us. "Good. Then it's time you both saw what's actually behind the curtain. Put on your best clothes, the ones you haven't sold yet. We're going to the office. Together." The drive to the Sterling Global headquarters was different this time. We didn't ride in a flashy sports car with music blaring. We sat in the back of the sedan in a heavy, expectant silence. Ethan and Eleanor looked out the windows at the city they thought they owned, seeing it now through the eyes of people who understood how fragile status truly is. When we pulled up to the glass and steel monolith that bore a name they only vaguely associated with my boring work, the security team straightened their backs. The lobby, a cathedral of marble and light, went quiet as we entered. "Good morning, Mr. Vance," the head of security said, nodding with genuine deference. He didn't look at Ethan or Eleanor. His eyes were fixed on me. I led them toward the private elevator, the one that required a biometric scan. As the doors closed, Eleanor whispered, "You own this building, don't you?" I looked at the floor numbers climbing rapidly. "I own the vision that built it. The bricks are just a consequence." We stepped out onto the top floor, an expanse of mahogany and panoramic views of the lake. My executive team was already gathered in the conference room. They were men and women who had moved markets while my children were sleeping off hangovers. I saw the shock on my children's faces as they realized these power players weren't just my colleagues. They were my subordinates. I took my seat at the head of the table and gestured for Ethan and Eleanor to sit in the chairs behind me, the ones reserved for observers. "Today's agenda is simple," I told the room, my voice echoing with a cold authority. "Victor Thorne has attempted to infiltrate this family through my son. He believes we are fractured. He believes that the Vance legacy is a fruit ripe for the picking because he saw the outward appearance of decay." I turned my chair slightly to look at my children. He didn't realize that the decay was a controlled burn. We are clearing the brush to make room for new growth. For the next 4 hours, they watched as I dismantled Thorne's strategy with the precision of a master chess player. I didn't use anger. I used data. I showed them how I had anticipated Thorne's move months in advance, how I had set up poison pill provisions in our contracts that would bankrupt anyone who tried to force a takeover. I saw Ethan leaning forward, his mind finally engaging with a complexity that his crypto schemes never possessed. I saw Eleanor taking notes, her eyes wide as she realized the sheer scale of the responsibility I had been carrying alone. When the meeting adjourned, the room cleared, leaving only the three of us. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the office in shades of orange and gold. "Why didn't you tell us?" Ethan asked, his voice devoid of the old arrogance. "If we knew, if we had any idea this was what you were doing." I stood up and walked to the window. "If I had told you, you would have treated it like a toy. You would have used this power to bully people, to buy more things that didn't matter. I had to wait until you knew what it felt like to have nothing, so that you would respect what it means to have everything." I turned back to them. "I was A failure as a father because I thought providing for you meant protecting you from reality. I was wrong. Reality is the only thing that builds character. I spent 30 years building a fortune, but I almost lost my children in the process. I walked over to Ethan and placed a hand on his shoulder. You showed me something today when you ripped up that check. You showed me that you're finally ready to start at the bottom. The real bottom. Inside this company. Not as an executive, but as an analyst, you'll earn every cent. I looked at Eleanor. And you. Your charity work was a fashion statement. If you want to run a foundation, you're going to work for the people we actually help. You're going to see the impact of our capital on the ground. No more galas until you've worked in the clinics. Eleanor stood up, her face resolute. She didn't complain about her shoes or her social standing. She simply nodded. When do we start? She asked. I looked at my watch. Tomorrow, 6 a.m. And don't be late. The old man doesn't tolerate tardiness in his employees. For the first time in my life, I saw them look at each other not as rivals for an inheritance, but as partners in a legacy. The war was over, and while the scars remained, the healing had finally begun. I had lost a lifetime to silence, but I had gained a future for my bloodline. The transition wasn't overnight, and the path was far from easy. For the first few months, Ethan and Eleanor lived in the humble guest quarters of our estate, paying a modest rent from the entry-level salaries I paid them. I watched them struggle. I watched Ethan come home with bloodshot eyes from analyzing spreadsheets, and I watched Eleanor return with dirt under her fingernails from the community gardens our foundation supported. There were nights when the old resentment flared up, nights when they looked at me with a lingering bitterness for the cruelty of my lesson. But as the months turned into a year, that bitterness transformed into a profound, unbreakable respect. They stopped seeing me as a bank or a burden. They began to see me as a man who had sacrificed his own reputation to save their souls. The climax of our journey came during the annual Sterling Global Gala, a real one this time. For years I had skipped these events, preferring to remain the ghost in the machine. But tonight was different. I stood backstage, adjusting my cufflinks, feeling the weight of the moment. Victor Thorne was there, lurking in the corners, still nursing the wounds of his failed takeover. He still thought he could find a crack in our armor. He approached Ethan near the bar, likely preparing one last desperate pitch. I watched from the shadows, ready to intervene, but I stopped myself. I didn't need to protect Ethan anymore. I hear your father has you working in the basement, Ethan, Thorne said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. It's a tragedy, really. A man of your talents wasting away while the old man hoards the gold. My offer still stands. I can put you where you belong. Ethan didn't even flinch. He took a sip of his water, no longer the expensive scotch he used to demand, and looked Thorne dead in the eye. You're right, Victor. I am in the basement. I'm learning how the foundation is poured. Because unlike you, I plan on building something that actually lasts. And as for my father, he's not hoarding anything. He's teaching me how to carry the weight, something you wouldn't understand. Thorne withered under that gaze and slinked away into the crowd. I stepped out from the curtains, and Ethan caught my eye. He gave me a sharp, respectful nod, the kind given between two men who truly understand one another. Eleanor joined us, looking radiant not because of the jewelry she wore, but because of the genuine purpose in her smile. She had spent the day organizing a relief fund for local families, and the glow of her success was brighter than any diamond. We stood together, the Vance family, finally united by truth rather than by transaction. I am Arthur Vance. I was a man who nearly lost everything by trying to give my children everything. I spent a lifetime in the shadows, letting them believe I was a failure, so I could see who they really were. It was a dangerous gamble, one that almost cost me my family. But standing here now, watching them lead with integrity and strength, I know it was the only way. To any father listening, do not shield your children from the sun, or they will never learn to grow. Do not give them a life they haven't earned, or they will never value the man who provided it. My failure was my silence. My success was finally finding the courage to speak the truth. Today, I am no longer the old man eating crumbs in the office. I am a father, a mentor, and a leader. And for the first time in my life, when my children look at me, they don't see a paycheck. They see a man they are proud to call their own. The empire I built is finally in safe hands, not because of the money in the bank, but because of the character of those who will inherit it. The masquerade is over, and the real life has finally begun. Thank you for joining us for this emotional journey on Dr. Harmony. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of the power of truth in a family, please hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story of transformation. Until next time.